sharing my screen now. And as I said, this webinar is in partnership with World Outside My Shoes, and Carl Wilkins is the co-founder and director of World Outside My Shoes. So I'm going to hand over to Carl Wilkins to say a few words and to officially begin the webinar. Carl.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ndu. Man, I like that new little exercise that you've got going there, and that we can respond and see the response. I'm going to have to learn that trick from you. We've all been just getting so skilled at Zoom, which is one of the big gifts of COVID. And at least I'm still looking at it as a big gift. Thank you so much to you, Ndu, Tali, for pulling together today's event. I am super excited about it. We had such a great time with Phil Clark a couple of weeks ago, and I learned so much. And Phil, it was just like, we have a picture maybe this big, and then we have a Zoom like this, and I'm sure it's going to be that way with Hollie today too, that all of a sudden we're like, yeah, okay, now I see things much, much larger and I would say much more human. It goes from the theory part to the real life story part. And I know Hollie's got stories for us today, which I'm a story nut, so I'm super excited about that. And some of you, that would be fun to do. I'm thinking about more of those little question and answer things in terms of how many people familiar with Gachacha and familiar with Tej camps and people involved, for example, in mediation and reconciliation work. And yesterday I was talking with a group in Northern Macedonia, and we're looking at how's this putting things back together in Rwanda. What does it have to offer us in our societies? And I know in America, we got a ton to learn from this idea of understanding the harm and then making a repair plan to respond to that harm and getting everybody's voices involved. So I'm super excited today to hear about the people coming home from prison and how they're received at home and what life is like for them. I love these firsthand reports like we're going to get today. So I'm really grateful to you, the Johannesburg Holocaust Center. It's so fun to partner with you all again. And Tali, it's so good to see you. And I'm really excited about today's conversation. So I will pass it off to you, Tali.
Thank you, Carl. And just wonderful to see so many friends here, teachers and lecturers. I see David Simon with us. I see Bjorn with us. And I see our friend Dennis from Rwanda, and really wonderful, wonderful people to engage. And Hollie, thank you. You were supposed to come to South Africa last year. COVID hit. So we have you on Zoom, and we are so pleased to have you with us on Zoom and learn from you, because of course I had the pleasure of knowing you for some years now. And the last time we met was in Rwanda in April of 2019. And I just find your subject fascinating. We have with us tonight a Holocaust survivor, Pinchas Guta, and Pinchas will agree with me that in the Holocaust and in Rwanda, what is fascinating is that most of those killers never committed crime before, then committed atrocious crimes during that genocide. And then I'm very curious for you to share with us, do they commit crimes after they are released, or what is the situation that you discovered through your research? So let me introduce Hollie very briefly to you. Dr. Hollie Nyseth Brehm is an associate professor of sociology and criminology at the Ohio State University. She has published many dozens of articles and book chapters on genocide and human rights, and is a recipient of the International Association of Genocide Scholars Emerging Scholars Prize. And we are proud to be also part of the association, and proud that you received that wonderful award, as well as you received the American Society of Criminology's Cavan Young Scholar Award. And this is the highest honors given to early career scholars in each association. So you are a chief investigator of 2 grants from the National Science Foundation that each focus on transitional justice in Rwanda. And Hollie serves on a US atrocity prevention task force, also serves on the advisory board of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So it is really wonderful to learn from you today about the research, and we are not giving up. We hope that in 2022, we will also see you in person. The Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tali, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm going to get my PowerPoint keyed up, and while I do that, I absolutely agree and hope that I'll be able to be with many of you in person in the future at some point in time. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that I've been working on for the last few years, and it's a project that is still in progress. So I really very much look forward to our conversation that we can have about this after my presentation. During the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, hundreds of thousands of Rwandans engaged in violence. As Tali was mentioning, many of these individuals, in fact, the majority, had not previously engaged in violence, but they picked up clubs and machetes and joined killing groups that targeted Tutsi in their neighborhood and beyond. In the aftermath of this genocide, the new Rwandan government created a localized court system to hold many of these individuals accountable for their actions and to have community conversations about what happened. As I'll tell you more about in a little bit, this court system sent several 100,000 people to prison and to a comparable organization called TIJ. And over the last decade, if not more, these individuals have been coming back to their society. One of the most interesting aspects of this case is that these people are typically moving back to the very communities where they committed violence in 1994, and often living side by side with the very people that they harmed. This entire effort has been nothing short of massive. So as you see on the screen here, you see the incarceration rate in the US and in Rwanda. And I compare the US in part because I am American, but more so the US typically has one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire world. And as you see for the case of Rwanda, right in the aftermath of the genocide, the incarceration rate soared, and gradually these individuals have been coming back to their communities. I was in Rwanda studying the Gacaca courts about a decade ago and became fascinated by what was happening as these people were coming back to their communities. What were the dynamics that were unfolding? Again, this is nothing short of massive. If hundreds of thousands of people are incarcerated for violence against their community and then come back to those very same communities, what does that mean for peace and stability long-term within a country that experienced such massive violence? So I met with some folks in Rwanda, including the Rwanda Correctional Services, and tried to understand if someone was studying this process in depth. And at that time, no one was. So I wrote a grant to get funding from the US to be able to study what was taking place. And more broadly, this project has a couple of big picture questions before we narrow into what we'll focus on today. So I'm really interested in the obstacles these individuals who are leaving prison or TIJ, which I'll tell you more about shortly, that they're facing as they're coming back to their communities. And I'm also equally interested in the factors that are associated with successful reintegration. So what is successful reintegration? What does this look like? And then what are the factors at the individual, family, community, and state level that impact successful reintegration? Of course, in 40-ish minutes, I cannot tell you about all of this. So I'm going to focus specifically on initial reentry. So what's happening in the initial weeks and months after someone comes back from being incarcerated. And I'm also going to focus specifically on social reintegration. So this is someone's ties with their family and their broader community, as opposed to something like economic reintegration or political reintegration, but I'm happy to tell you more about that as well. So specifically, in about 40 minutes, I will try to give you a little bit of the framing of the project. As a sociologist and criminologist and a professor, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you at least a little bit about the theory, which is basically the ideas that guide this project, but I promise I'll keep that very brief. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the case of Rwanda. I saw that many of you, the majority, work in this area, live in Rwanda. You don't need me to tell you too much about it, but I'd still like to give you just a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with the case. Then I'll tell you a little bit about my methods, but I'll spend most of the time talking about a couple of key insights, specifically 3 key insights that I've learned so far, specifically, again, with respect to initial reentry and what's happening as people are coming home, what is facilitating this process, and what are the possible challenges that people are facing. And then at the end, I'll zoom back out and talk a little bit about broader implications. I think that we can learn a lot from the case of Rwanda. So I'll take a step back and say, what can we learn worldwide from this very unique and important case? I should also note, if you have questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat, and I'm happy to try to monitor both. I know we're doing questions at the end, but if something comes to you, please feel free to shoot it out there, and I can try to address it as I go, or at least keep an eye on it in some way. So to start then, to take one big step back again before narrowing in, it's really important to note that there is a lot of research on reentry and reintegration, although very little on reentry and reintegration following genocide. And this is surprising in many ways, because for decades, criminologists have been looking at what happens when people commit violence, leave their family, are incarcerated, and come back home. And for decades, scholars of political science have also been looking at what happens when people join armies, commit violence, leave their families and communities, and come back home. So I'm drawing on a lot of this research that other people have engaged in before me, both in terms of what happens when people are in prison, what happens when people are in armies or militias and come back, and what really aids this process. And just to tell you a little bit about what we know about this and how this informs the study, we know that reentry and reintegration is a dynamic process, and that means that it is impacted by a lot of factors at a lot of different points in time. So we know that if someone is leaving prison and going back to their community, their life, even before they went to prison, mattered. Their experiences in prison mattered, such as if they were visited by their family or how long they were in prison. Their immediate post-prison experiences matter. So are they able to find housing, for instance? What does that look like? And then their longer reintegration experiences matter as well. So what type of employment do they have? How are they treated by their neighbors? And we also know that these factors matter at different conceptual levels. So we know that individual level factors matter. For instance, in the US, it's a lot harder for men to go back and reintegrate into their communities than it is for women. And it's a lot harder for younger people often than for older people. We know that the family matters as well. So how accepting is someone's family? Again, were they visiting them when they were in prison? Have they accepted them once they're back? The same for a community. We know it's often easier for people to come back from prison when they're going back to a very tight-knit community. And then, of course, state factors matter as well. So oftentimes countries pass laws that can make it easier or harder for people to come back home. In the US, for instance, we often restrict voting rights for certain groups of people who serve time in prison. And we actually know this is pretty detrimental long term. So there's a lot going on in this space. And I just wanted to set that up before really narrowing in on some of the theory that we're going to talk about today. And I promise this is the last background theoretical slide, just to give you a little bit of background from some of the research that I'm coming from. Today, the stories I'll be telling you about focus specifically on one theory from the hundreds of theories tied to what I was just telling you about. And this theory is called labeling theory. And if you haven't studied it or heard of it, it basically just means that labels matter. How we label ourselves and how other people label us is actually really, really consequential for our behavior. So in particular, when it comes to violent crime, we know that if people are labeled just based on their actions that occurred, that bad actions that they did, this can actually create a lot of problems for them based on how they respond to this label and how other people respond to this label. Again, in the US context, as well as in Europe, there have been really interesting studies of what happens when someone is labeled based on their crime and how that then impacts them later in life. So in the US, there's an option for someone to be given a felony, which is basically a really severe type of crime. And they become labeled as a felon if they have a felony. And there have been some really interesting studies that have basically looked at individuals with all else constant. So same age, same crime, same family circumstances, but one was labeled a felon and one wasn't. And it found that the people labeled felons were 4 times more likely to go back to a life of violence and crime than the people who weren't labeled it. And labeling theories suggests that this is broadly because labels really matter. And if people are labeled a certain way by society, often then that very same society ostracizes them and pushes them towards subgroups that can be dangerous and that can be willing to accept them in spite of this nefarious label. So we know that labels really, really matter. And that it's often important to think about people, not just by the actions that they committed that were negative, but as people separate from these actions. And we'll talk much more about this, and I'll give you some context to really make this make sense. We also know that because these labels matter, they are reaffirmed often by people's communities, and that it's important to pay attention to how a community labels someone, how a community treats someone. There have been some really interesting studies of former combatants, one in particular, a study of former combatants in Liberia. And this survey asked them, what would make you return to violence? And one of the top two answers was being rejected by their family and their community. So as we're paying attention to labels, how people are being labeled, we're also paying attention to our communities accepting people. What does this look like? And this might also involve gestures of reacceptance. So how are people actually being shown they're being accepted into their society? I realize this all seems very abstract, but I promise in a little bit it'll make sense as I show you how this actually is playing out in the case of Rwanda. Okay, so in this study, I'm looking at reentry and reintegration, again, in the case of Rwanda, and drawing from these different theories to try to understand what is happening as Rwandans are going back home from prison or from other incarceration experiences. And in order to understand what's happening, you need a little bit of background about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Of course, anytime someone tries to give the background of a genocide in 2 minutes, they're going to gloss over important things. But to give you a little bit of a background, it's important to know that before colonialism in Rwanda, there were three main social groups, the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Twa. And that before colonialism, these groups were actually class-based, and that Tutsi tended to be the wealthy individuals within society, and that Hutu and Twa were not. Again, it's a lot more complicated than this, and I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, but it's important to know that at least about the case of Rwanda. It's also important to know that these groups changed and shifted with the advent of colonialism in Rwanda. Rwanda was colonized by Germany and then by Belgium, and Belgium in particular instituted a census and identification cards that really took up these labels and started to change what they meant. So because Belgian colonizers saw Tutsi as superior because these were the wealthy individuals, they had some fairly racist ideas, and they suggested that Tutsi were essentially better than Hutu, and because of this, that they were taller, that they had lighter skin, that they had smaller noses. Again, really racist thinking that racialized these existing identities that again were class-based and morphed them into what researchers often call racialized ethnicities. So tied to phenotypical characteristics, these became really real in Rwandan social life. And the Belgian colonizers also instituted systems of power whereby Tutsi, who were the minority, usually about 14 to 15% of the population, actually held the majority of the power within Rwandan society, and that Hutu, who were roughly at varying times about 84% of the population, typically had very little hold on power. And this created a pretty dangerous system within Rwandan society, again, that the colonizers had propped up and instigated, and that lasted for a couple of decades. This system essentially shifted during the 50s and 60s with something known as the Hutu Revolution and the advent of the first Hutu president of Rwanda. And at this point in time, essentially, you saw Hutu holding positions of power, Tutsi not holding positions of power, and discrimination against Tutsi, rallying around this idea that Hutu had long been subjugated because Tutsi had collaborated with the colonizers, had benefited from the colonizers, and had kept Hutu subjugated because of this. So there was a lot of discrimination against Tutsi, a lot of violence against Tutsi during the 50s and 60s and 70s. And this set up a pretty dangerous situation, once again, where one group held power and blamed the other group for what they saw as years of marginalization. Again, as we're just speeding along the Rwandan timeline in a very fast fashion, This essentially culminated in a civil war in 1990 between Hutu and Tutsi, and specifically a rebel army of Tutsi who had fled the country during some of this discrimination in the decades prior, were not allowed to come back into the country legally and decided to come back by force and try to gain entrance to their country. And the civil war took place essentially right before the genocide started and had spread a lot of fear amongst Rwandan society. And then, of course, for those of you familiar with the case, know on April 6, 1994, the president of Rwanda was actually coming back from talks tied to the civil war when his plane was shot down by unknown assailants. And just a few hours later, roadblocks were set up around the capital city, and this horrific genocide began. Over the next 3 months, upwards of 1 million people were killed. And again, this violence was largely committed by civilians, though it was largely planned by individuals in positions of power in the government. And I'm happy to talk more about that as well. Millions more were displaced and hundreds of thousands of people were raped. And of course, there was widespread property destruction. So this genocide essentially touched the lives of everyone in some way, because this was a relatively small country, between 7.5 and 8 million at the time of the genocide. And again, as it ended, the Rwandan society was completely in shambles. And the new government had to decide how to hold people accountable and also how to bring people together again. If you have a situation in which neighbors essentially killed neighbors, a situation in which, again, millions, or at least over 1 million were killed, millions more were displaced, and this is a really small country, the new government also had to decide how could people come together once again, and what could this look like? And by the same token, how could you hold people accountable for their actions? After a lot of deliberation and a few different trials, they landed on the Gacaca courts. And I'm happy to talk more about this court system afterwards. And I know Dennis Bikesha, who's with us, worked with these courts in depth and is a true expert on these courts. So if folks have questions, we can have a large conversation on Gacaca. But basically, just to give you a little bit of information of the system that put the people into incarceration that we'll be discussing shortly, the government created this localized court system at local levels throughout Rwandan communities. And essentially every community known as a sector, and in some cases cells, came together to elect people to serve as judges. And they had trials every week, sometimes multiple times a week, for upwards of a decade within Rwandan society. This court system had trials so often that it actually had almost 2 million trials. And I worked with the Rwandan National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide to create databases of these trials and try to understand how many existed, what did they look like. And to give you a little bit of background, the crime of genocide did not exist in Rwandan's criminal code before the genocide. So the new government had to essentially create categories of genocidal crime and try to decide how would it hold someone accountable for genocide? What would a crime of genocide look like? And after a couple of different iterations, it finally resolved with 3 different categories, categories 1, 2, and 3. Category 3, you see on the bottom, this was by far the most common. These were crimes against property. So by far, most of the trials were crimes against property. And this would be, for instance, often individuals would loot the homes of Tutsi, or sometimes loot dead bodies, or would destroy homes, for instance. And while crimes of property often aren't actually considered in the international legal definition of genocide, a lot of Rwandans felt that this was really consequential to have your belongings taken or to have your home destroyed, and that this needed to be involved in this process. Crimes against property, however, were not met with prison sentences. They were met with essentially what was meant to be reparations, and meant to essentially, if someone stole something, they were meant to give it back to the family or pay back an equivalent value. So these crimes did not alone result in any type of incarceration. Categories 1 and 2 were the ones that resulted in incarceration. And as you'll see, category 2 was essentially murder, intent to murder, torture. And then category 1 was reserved for the crimes that were seen as particularly serious. So planning, organizing, supervising the violence. individuals who had positions of leadership and were able to oversee or get people to act in a number of different ways. And then, of course, also violence tied to that is sexual in nature, such as rape and sexual torture. And you'll see that this was about 3% of the cases, though I should point out that it's widely believed that rape was a lot more pervasive. And this is often very hard to try in a court of law. And a lot of people were not willing to come forward to talk about it, even though Gacaca did put in place a lot of systems to try to enable this to occur. So throughout this process, about 230,000 people were found guilty of genocidal violence in categories 1 and 2. So again, we've created a database of all of these different trials and of the individuals who went through this system. And if this number seems a lot smaller than the numbers on the previous slide, it's because individuals were typically tried in more than one location. So if you committed violence in 3 different communities, you had to be tried in each of those communities to draw upon the knowledge of the people in those communities, and so the people in the communities could have conversations about what happened. So roughly 230,000 people were found guilty of category 1 and 2 crimes. And these individuals were broadly sent to prison and to something known as TIGE. So TIGE is a French acronym for a community service camp. And essentially, someone could be sent to TIGE if they confessed and expressed remorse during their trial or at certain times during their trial. They were given the option to have their sentence cut in half. And then typically they would spend half of the sentence in prison and half of the sentence in TIGE. So say they were sentenced 14 years, 7 could be in prison and 7 could be in TIGE. And TIGE was seen as particularly valuable because individuals could be out in the community. They actually had the ability to go home once a year. They engage in public works in their community, often building roads or schools, or ironically, sometimes prisons. So TIGE was generally seen as somewhat more desirable. So many people did opt for this option to confess and express remorse and be able to have part of their sentence in TIGE. I'm happy to talk more about this, but this is the broader system and the broader structure of incarceration within Rwanda, where you have hundreds of thousands of people going through this court system, standing trial in the Gacaca courts, receiving a prison sentence or a sentence to TIGE or both, and then carrying out their sentence. And I will say that generally these sentences are fairly light compared to other standards. There was a life sentence, but about 5% of all trials resulted in life sentences, and the vast majority of others resulted in sentences whereby someone would be allowed to come home. The average was often for folks in category 2 about 12 to 15 years, and for folks in category 1 about 20 to 25 years. So still sometimes pretty lengthy sentences, but nonetheless sentences that would enable individuals to come home. So as I mentioned, I was in Rwanda studying the Gacaca courts as people were coming home, and became fascinated by what was happening as they're coming home. What are the systems put in place to help them? What does this mean for peace and stability in Rwanda? What does it mean for peace and stability in other parts of the world? So I designed a study with the help of a number of wonderful Rwandan colleagues I'll mention in a moment, to follow 200 people who were leaving prison as well as TIGE camps in 2018. And the study has 181 men and 19 women. And the study has 180 people convicted of crimes of genocide, and then 20 people convicted of ordinary crimes, for lack of a better word. So these would be people who were in prison for homicide not during the genocide, or for theft or burglary or something like that, just so I could better understand what might be unique about coming back from prison or TIGE after genocide compared to an ordinary crime again. I'm not going to talk too much about those 20 people, but I'm happy to talk more about the differences in Q&A if you would like to talk about them. For the 180 people who are convicted of crimes of genocide, these individuals serve sentences anywhere from 8 to 25 years. And in the broader study, though I'm not going to talk about it, we designed it to try to look at a number of different factors. So they're coming back both from prison and TIGE. So again, from being incarcerated within a prison to this community service camp, going home. And they're also coming back to urban and rural areas. So we were really interested in trying to understand what are some of the differences we can leverage, and how do these experiences vary, whether they're in Kigali, the capital city, or a really rural city 3 hours away, or whether they leave from Tige or prison. I'm not going to talk too much about these differences today, but I am happy to tell you more if you have questions about them. But again, I'm giving you the broader structure of the study before diving into initial reentry. For the project itself, me and a wonderful team of fantastic Rwandan researchers, the three main ones, you'll see their names on the screen here, who've been just integral to the entire study and will be working with me to publish various aspects of the study. We decided to interview folks 3, possibly 4 times. So we talked with everyone before they left prison or Tige, and traveled around and actually did interviews in every Tige camp and every prison in Rwanda in 2017, before these individuals were being released. And we asked them questions about, again, what they did during the genocide, about their family, about their communities, about their trials, about their life in prison, and also importantly about what they thought going back to their communities would be like. Again, many of these folks had been in prison, 18, 20 years and hadn't been home, or sometimes hadn't seen their family. So we were really curious to learn, what did they think was going to happen when they went back to their communities? What were their hopes and their fears? These interviews were typically about 4 hours. They were quite long. I'm happy to talk more about that. And we also interviewed community members to see on the other side, what did they think was going to happen? How are they preparing for this reentry and reintegration? What did they view it as happening, and how was this connected to their everyday life? Once these individuals left prison or Tige, we found them 6 months and then 1 year later, and conducted follow-up interviews in their homes, or if they preferred, at a nonprofit in Kigali, the capital city, and asked them a lot of questions about what it was like to come home, about their relationships with their family, with their communities, if they had found work, if they were talking with survivors, what was life like? And again, we did it at different times because, as I mentioned at the outset, this is a really dynamic process, and something that really changes over time. So this was something that we really wanted to make sure that we could actually track over time and see how it was changing. So for a subset of folks, we also talked with them 2 years after they came home to really see what had changed. Just this last summer, in the depths of COVID, we also conducted some interviews, again, really spearheaded by my team in Rwanda, since I could not be there for this part, with community members, and got a sense from them about what they saw. Again, what was reentry and reintegration like for them? How did they view this process? So that we really understood the full picture, the stories from the people coming home and the stories from the people in the communities accepting them, to really try to understand. And again, these interviews involve questions about well-being, about health, sort of really spanning the gamut. I'm going to skip this. This is a little bit about the community member interviews that my team spearheaded just this last summer. So just to broadly tell you, because I'm running short on time and I really want to leave time for the actual stories of what's happening, is that we talked with a number of different community members. We started with some focus groups, which are group interviews, and then talked with a number of different community members. And my team member, Eric Sibomano, really spearheaded finding individuals from a lot of different groups, survivors, returnees, individuals who didn't participate but were alive in 1994, college students who are not alive, really trying to understand how did different people view this process? How was it impacting them? And again, across different communities within Rwanda. Okay. So what are we finding so far? As you can imagine, there's a lot, but what I'd like to tell you about for the rest of the talk is 3 primary insights regarding their initial reentry and social reintegration. So again, initial reentry is really these weeks and months after someone's home. We've been tracking them a lot longer, but a lot of research really suggests that these first few weeks and months are really important to set the stage long-term. So you really want to focus on what's happening over these first weeks that someone is home and what are their experiences like. Again, also focusing on social reintegration. So this is someone's ties to their family and their community, not so much their economic reintegration, which is also very important as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're calling gestures of reacceptance and how this is impacting people, a little bit about structural narratives of violence and community blame, and then a little bit about how what I'm going to tell you about sort of varies based on social location, or how someone's identity, whether it's their gender or their socioeconomic status, actually varies some of the things that I will tell you about. To start then, you might be wondering, what is happening as people are coming home? This is a huge question, right? So as I've just told you, there is this, cataclysmic event that touched the lives of almost everyone in Rwanda, that people were sent to be incarcerated for a number of years, and they're coming back to their communities, often to live side by side by the people that they harmed. And this might set up a situation in which you might think, people aren't being welcomed. There'd be a lot of good reason to think that people aren't being welcomed back into the communities, that they're being ostracized. A lot of good theory would suggest that this would be what's happening. And I'm happy to tell you that in most cases, that's not the case. So generally, people are being welcomed by their families and their neighbors. And it's initial welcomes, I should say. I'm not saying that everything is rosy and fine and that there are no lingering issues, but rather as people are coming home, the vast majority of people told us stories about small gestures that essentially marked their transition from incarceration back to their communities. And these small gestures could be smiles from neighbors, they could be visits from neighbors, dinners with neighbors, and again, neighbors who were survivors. So not just neighbors who were not as impacted by the violence, but perhaps survivors who were even sometimes harmed by their actions. And people would tell us these stories during these interviews of what was happening as they were coming home. Just to give you a few examples, someone said it was joy, it was a celebratory moment, and people were happy and were very supportive. They brought maize flour for making porridge, so they were supportive, and this was a sign that they were happy to see us back. Another person said, there are people I never expected to help or to greet me, and they did it. Neighbors would come with Fanta. Some friends would come and give me small amounts of money. Just to give you one of many other examples, Fidel was someone who had a very typical story. He came back from prison and he didn't know the way home. This was really common. Rwanda has changed a lot since 1994. So a lot of folks, their first obstacle was how do they find their house when the entire country looks different? How do they make it home? And his wife and son actually met him at a bus stop. Which happened often, but not always. Some people found their entire way by themselves. But in this case, his wife and son met him at a bus stop and they walked him back to their house and they were introducing him to people on the way, or saying, oh, remember, this is so-and-so, this is the neighbor so-and-so, trying to help him to remember who people were since he hadn't seen them in so long. And then he was telling us about what happened. And he said the following day, some of the neighbors came to his house. They came and we shared. Each of them contributed money for one bottle of alcohol. Later, he said a few days later, he even visited the sibling of someone he killed. And he was really nervous for this, but he told us how they went to a bar and they shared and they talked. And again, in his words, we shared a glass. So these stories are emblematic. We have many more. And they're stories that are important because they're showing a lot of important things that are happening in Rwanda. So these small gestures, these smiles, these Fantas, these bags of flour, sometimes these dinners are really important for a variety of reasons. We're calling them gestures of reacceptance, which is a term in part by someone known as Braithwaite in criminology. And these are essentially small gestures that signify that Rwandans are willing to accept people back into their communities. To be very clear, again, it doesn't mean that everything is rosy and fine, but it does mean that these individuals are seeing signs that people are willing to have them back. And these signs are really important. If you think about it, when someone engages in violence or goes to prison, their identity changes a lot. We know that violent groups have a lot of rituals to shift someone's identity. We know that in prison, people's identities are totally stripped away and become something quite different because of what it is like to live every day in prison, which we call a total institution. So we know that as people lose their old identities and form these new identities, it's really important to think about their identities as they come back to their communities. And for many of the people in this study, these small gestures of reacceptance are both showing that their community members are welcoming them, at least in some way, and also helping them think about their identity and serving essentially as a ritual that helps them to essentially break with their past and start to think about their new identity within their society. And this might sound a little abstract, but we know that rituals or rites of passage are really important within societies worldwide. It could be something really large to mark some kind of transition, like a baby shower or a bachelorette party or a bridal shower or a wedding or a graduation ceremony. People worldwide create rituals to mark transitions and changes in status. And while they don't necessarily have to be these huge rituals, we know that small things, again, a dinner with someone, a trip to a bar to share a drink, that these can also be really important rituals that mark these shifts in these people's identities from people who were in prison for committing horrific acts to people who are rejoining Rwandan society once again. And a lot of folks had narratives that really matched this. So again, just a few quotes that are emblematic of the majority of the quotes. Someone said, "This is an amazing situation beyond any comparison to be back." And also it kind of corrected my feeling people hated me. Actually, a lot of the folks that we spoke with were surprised that this was happening. Not all, but many didn't know that this was going to happen, were nervous to go back to their communities, and were pleasantly surprised when they were able to tell us stories of things like this happening. Again, with the idea that identities are important, a lot of folks also shared how their identities were shifting. So a lot of folks said, "I became a citizen again. I am no longer a genocidaire. I'm a new person now." In fact, many of the folks in this study really rejected the term genocidaire, which is the common term we use in genocide studies to talk about the people who committed violence, even the name perpetrator. And a lot of them said, I'm not that anymore. I don't want people to use that terminology anymore. And this really affirms the importance of first-person language. So basically putting the person before the act and talking about some people who committed genocide, not a genocidaire. By the same token, in the US, actually, our Department of Justice in 2017 said, let's not call folks felons anymore. There's someone who committed a felony, but they're a person and they're not totally defined by this one horrific act, the worst thing they did in their life. It's part of them, and we certainly can't forget about it. But if you only define someone by this act, that can actually hinder their reintegration, hinder them finding new pro-social identities, and hinder how other people see them in society. If we actually expect people to integrate and join society and be a cohesive society once again, these labels can be pretty detrimental. So many of the folks were really adamant that they didn't want to be called genocidaires, which isn't actually fully encouraged by Rwandan policy yet, but one of the recommendations we'll be making is to think critically about these labels that people are given and how it might be impacting them. These identities are also reinforced by these individuals trying to do things that affirm their new identities. So many people are very, very adamant that they want to participate in their community as much as they can. And Rwandan policy broadly really supports this. So many people talked with us about the meetings, the community meetings they were going to, or Umuganda, which is like a monthly community service event. And if they could, they were really, really eager to be part of these processes because it affirmed their identity as a Rwandan, once again, as a citizen. Again, they're shifting identity, which was really important for understanding how they were seeing their return to their communities, and really impacted by these gestures of reacceptance that they were receiving from the people within the communities. Okay, so you might be wondering, why? why are people being welcomed? What is facilitating this? Of course, the Rwandan government did encourage people to welcome people, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And I think there's a lot of things that facilitate this, but I'm going to tell you about one that to me is really important as a sociologist. And this is what I would call a structural narrative of the violence. So when you ask Rwandans about why people participate in genocide, which again, we did last summer in interviews, and I did way back in 2016 and 2017 before starting this study, when talking with community members about reentry and reintegration, we always ask, why does someone participate in genocide? What causes someone to do that? And there is a very strong narrative in Rwanda that couches someone's public participation in the genocide within broader structural factors that cause the genocide. So a lot of people, if you'll ask them, what causes someone to participate in genocide. Rather than going to the individual and saying they were greedy, they were this, they were that, they'll take a step back and say, you know, to really understand why someone participated in genocide, you have to understand this broader story of the genocide. Some of the factors that I highlighted for you all about 20 minutes ago, saying you have to understand colonialism and how this impacted how people thought about what it meant to be Hutu and Tutsi. And you have to understand the government and how the government at the time was encouraging people to participate. And you have to understand that local leaders were encouraging people. So really broadly, essentially telling folks that there is this broader narrative of what happened. And these narratives are particularly important because they help people to understand why someone might engage in genocide. They don't make it okay. Of course, engaging in genocide is one of the most heinous crimes that people can imagine, but it still helps someone to understand that because someone does this, it doesn't make them a monster. It doesn't make them psychologically abnormal. Again, hundreds of thousands of people engaged in genocide. So this means that there has to be a lot going on that causes this to happen. And this structural narrative is important. And the government of Rwanda has done a lot of work to teach Rwandans broadly about this structural narrative. Every state narrative has problems. So I'm not trying to suggest it's a perfect narrative about what happened. And I'm happy to talk more about that as well. But they have in their curricula, they tell a very historical narrative of the genocide. In the memorials that now dot the landscape of Rwanda, there's a lot of history involved, whether it's history on the walls that people can read, history that the guides share. Often they don't just start by saying, this is what happened in this local spot here. They back up and they talk about colonialism and the governments and the different factors that impacted the violence. During commemoration period, they talk about it as well. And this broadly, again, is giving a structural view of individual action. In sociology, we call it sociological storytelling. And it's basically understanding that everyone has agency, everyone makes choices, but our choices are also constrained by a lot of other factors. And it doesn't take away responsibility. Very importantly, these people were still responsible for their actions. They could have made other choices. They could have not participated. They could have saved people. They did make choices, but it's still couching these choices within broader structure that helps people to understand how someone could make this choice in the first place. And this is really important when it comes, I think, to people coming back to their communities and to why the community members are at least open to possibly reintegrating folks back into their communities. In criminology, we talk about two types of shaming. There's stigmatization and there's reintegrative shaming. So stigma is, of course, what it sounds, essentially ostracizing someone for the bad things that they did. And reintegrative shaming is actually reinforcing membership in a community of law-abiding people. So again, if these people are coming back from prison and they're saying, I'm a citizen again, I'm a Rwandan again, they are wanting to join this community of law-abiding people. And it's important to reinforce that membership in a reintegrative way. And as we've just talked about, this is directed at the evil of the act rather than the evil of the person. So really understanding their act couched within this structural narrative rather than just seeing an individual as an evil person. And I think that how the Rwandan government and individuals involved in this framing have done this, it really suggests that where people locate blame and how they understand the causes of the violence and how they tell the stories of the violence is really important for thinking about these reentry and reintegration processes. So I don't have much time, but I'd like to spend the last 3 minutes and just tell you that the story isn't the same for everyone. So I've said generally there's the story where people are coming back to their communities. Generally, they're being welcomed by these gestures of reacceptance. Generally, these gestures of reacceptance are important for signaling that people are willing to have them back in their communities and for their own personal identities as they're going through this shift to becoming someone new and someone different back in their community, no longer a genocidaire, no longer someone in prison. And I've also told you that I think this is facilitated, at least in part, by this very structural narrative of the violence. It's important to note that in the 180 people that we've been following over time, this isn't the story for everyone. It's the story for the vast majority. Generally, people from lower socioeconomic status, so SES, basically how rich or poor someone is, are doing pretty well. And these are often the individuals who are benefiting from this narrative of blame, and the individuals who were farmers during the genocide, individuals who often did follow orders, individuals who were sort of lower in their socioeconomic status, these individuals in the study are actually doing pretty well. These are the ones being welcomed by their communities. And actually, it's the individuals who held positions of power within the government or in other settings during the genocide that are struggling a lot more as they're coming back to their communities. And this makes sense in light of what I just talked to you about a moment ago, how if there's this narrative of blame that ties it to local leaders, the local leaders are the ones who are struggling still as they're coming back to their communities, while it's the individuals who did not have a lot of power during the genocide are the ones who are generally being able to tell these narratives of acceptance and generally having an easier time as they're coming back home, which is really interesting because it's the exact opposite of what happens in a lot of Western countries. The other thing to note is that gender is really important. And I mentioned that there are 19 women in the study who were imprisoned or teased for genocide. And these women are categorically doing much worse than the men in the study. Generally, the men tell stories of their families waiting for them, their families keeping their farms running, their families welcoming them when they come home. And about 70% of the men who are in prison or teased for genocide are married right now. Only 3 of the 19 women have partners, so about 16%. And the women are doing just much worse overall. So they rarely had the same stories of being welcomed. They also rarely had the same socioeconomic status today. So I'm not really talking about economic reintegration, but the women were generally living in just abject poverty, often just trying to make it by, often moving in with an adult children if they could, if they had someone they could move in with, and if their family hadn't ostracized them. So the women's struggles were very different than the men's struggles. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. First, when you ask people about why women participated, in our community interviews, we often asked, what about women who participated in the genocide? And not always, but often people who will say, we can understand why people did this. And of course it was wrong, but we had colonialism, we had this, would still say, like a woman, I don't know how a woman does that. A woman raises children, a woman does this, a woman does this. Very gendered ideas about who could or should participate in the violence. And there's an idea amongst some folks in communities still that the women who participated are different, that if you were a woman and you engaged in violence, you went against something that was biologically, unnatural, and that you did these heinous things that we can understand men doing them, but not women. And this is common in a lot of countries that underwent conflict, and frankly, worldwide. Often we have gendered ideas about who can and should engage in violence, and often women who engage in extreme violence see more ostracization. Also, it was generally seen as acceptable for the men whose wives went to prison for them to remarry. So in most cases, these individuals often remarried. There was this idea that they couldn't live without a woman to help them with their family or with their farm. So it was seen as acceptable for them to remarry, where it wasn't the same case on the other side. So going forward, we'll be having some recommendations for how to really ease the transition for women in particular. It was a lot fewer women than men who engaged in genocidal violence, but it still was a significant number. And these individuals' reentry and reintegration experiences are a little bit different than this broader story I've been sharing. So I am out of time. Let me tell you really briefly about some broader implications. If you're going to think about some takeaway, and I saw the chat, my chat kept minimizing, so I'm sorry I didn't actually get to talk through your questions, but I'll look at them as we move into Q&A. But if you're thinking about some implications for Rwanda and beyond, and what are some things if you're going to take away from this talk and carry them forward? The first, again, is person first language. And it's clunky, right? So I actually don't even use the term perpetrator. I talk about people who committed violence, really clunky language. But we know from studies in labeling theory that these labels matter. And if someone is labeled a genocide, this is a sticky label that stays for a really long time, and it actually transcends to kids. I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but some folks had stories of how their kids were called kids of genocidaires or children of Interahamwe, which is one of the youth militias that were active. So this label can have a lot of implications generations down, and pretty strong implications for people's identities. And again, the folks in the study, which mirrors a lot of research on individuals who engage in violence worldwide, were really eager to shed this label and to see themselves not as a genocidaire, not as only defined by the worst thing they've ever done in their lives, but as a Rwandan, as a citizen, as something greater than, again, the worst thing that they've ever done. Also take away the importance of rites of passage and gestures of acceptance. So again, these are these rituals that are marking these key transitions. And as we think about someone coming back from prison or Tige in Rwanda, this is a huge transition in someone's life. And we have to pay attention to what it means to them and how people are being welcomed back. So these small rituals are highly meaningful, even if it might not seem meaningful for someone to receive a smile or to receive a soda or to have someone walk with them to a bar or to have a dinner. These really were highly meaningful for the individuals coming back to signify that there was a chance that they could be accepted again and to start to mark their identity as they shifted their identity. And I should just say just what resilience and remarkableness there shows of Rwandans, who again, many of the survivors that we interviewed, we're still cautious. Some folks had said, I used to think that 20 years was a long time. And then I saw the person who killed my brother or my child in my community, and I realized 20 years wasn't long at all. So of course, some folks are still harboring fear and anxiety and lingering trauma from this violence, but are still willing in many cases to at least show these gestures of reacceptance and to be open to the possibility of reintegrating individuals. Again, to conclude then, that structural narratives of violence are important. So as we think about the stories we tell about violence, to think not only about the individual factors and individuals who might be evil, as we often like to talk about sometimes, but really about these structural factors that impacted violence and how actually people understanding these complex structural historical narratives can actually aid peace years later. And then, of course, that these experiences vary by social location, so that it's not just monolithic, and that someone's socioeconomic status or their gender also impacts these experiences. So with that, thank you very much. Before I started, I was talking with a group of the folks. I have a 9-month-old son named Benjamin. He's Rwandan and American. You see him here. So someone asked, will he join us during the talk? And I said, no, he won't, but I can throw a picture on really fast. So this is Benjamin. And with that, thank you all so much for listening. And I really look forward to engaging with you and to your questions and comments.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Hollie, for that flawless and really enlightening conversation and presentation. There are so many questions. But the one point that stuck out for me, as just towards the end, was about the women perpetrators, or the women who committed acts of violence. And so there's a question that I think I would like to start with, which, because it's just burning in my mind, is from Carl, and he's asking, were women who refused to participate in genocide in as great of risk of being targeted or killed as a man who refused?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question, Carl. Absolutely. So interestingly enough, I would say generally they weren't at a great of a risk. And that might also be part of the reason why people are really struggling with understanding the women who did participate, because how it worked essentially, for those of you who don't know, although I know many of you know this generally, is that during the genocide, the interim government really tried to get mass participation. And there had been a lot of priming mechanisms for this beforehand. So when the Civil War started, there were efforts to create essentially local community defense groups. And they were typically men of upstanding citizenry within their communities. They often wanted men who were middle-aged, who were married. Interestingly enough, the average person found guilty of genocide was 34. It wasn't a young individual. It was someone who was actually quite older. And this was because I believe there was a huge effort to get individuals to participate and to frame this as standing up for one's country, standing up against a threat. So often during genocide, we know that there's this language that's very dangerous that frames a certain group of people as a threat and frames the other people as actually protecting their families and their communities from this threat to the nation. And this is very gendered language. And Rwanda in particular, they also called the violence work. Also very gendered language. So it was really targeting men in their communities to stand up against Tutsi, against this rebel army, but also by extension, all Tutsi, and targeting men to participate in the violence and framing it as patriotic and as a gendered duty. So I think in part because of this, the messaging was much more for men, who also, the army was mostly men, the positions of power were men. It was expected that men would participate, and women were not typically expected expected to participate in the same way. They were often expected to aid the men, to sometimes join killing groups and help in other ways, such as locating Tutsi or calling to locate or to help people find Tutsi, or to help, cook dinners for individuals when they came home from work. But there wasn't the same type of recruiting going on for women as there were for men. And as Carl is pointing out, often if people wouldn't participate, they often faced some type of violence themselves. There was a lot of killing groups that would travel around, and many people were encouraged to participate and basically told if they didn't participate that they or their family could be harmed. So a lot of people did participate out of fear. And it's absolutely right that women were not facing quite the same call towards violence in that way, although many were encouraged by their local family members. Many of the women that I've spoken with for this study and for a prior study, I asked, how did you, what was the story that brought you into the violence? What happened? And often they were actually brought into the violence by a brother or by a husband or by someone who was mobilized and then brought other people in. So they were recruited in their own social networks in a certain way and may have faced ramifications in their own networks had they not done anything. But more broadly, there wasn't the same targeting of women as for men. Which is why if you look at the Gacaca court cases, it's about 5% of cases in category 2 and category 1 involved women. So it is a really low number overall in terms of the entirety of the cases, but this is still thousands of women. I can pull up the exact numbers, but it's well over 20,000 who are still in prison or teased for these crimes, and then going back to their communities, having these experiences that are quite different than the men's.
Wow. It's interesting. We just did a conversation. Oh, yes. Carl?
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt there. I'm really glad, Holly. Thanks so much. The presentation has been amazing. I'm totally engrossed here. And I'm really appreciate that last statement you made, because it can be my question too, as I'm looking at my question for the second time, I'm like, wait a minute. I don't want to distract from the free ride, so to speak, the carte blanche that men often get that women don't get. And so I didn't want to detract from that by that question, and that's why I also appreciated your comment about men, brothers, husbands, dragging them in, the social pressure, the obedience to the male authority figures, and the fear of protecting your children. I think that's one way we say, oh yeah, women are nurturers, but they're also protecting their children. And so I'd be really interested to hear that. I know hear the more specific stories of the women, because I know when I visited Tiege camps and I would ask questions of the group, I was much more interested in the response of the women than the men, because I also had this bias in my mind of men killing, and they're going to give me the party line answer. Whereas I didn't feel like a woman was going to as much give me the party line answer. And so some of my own biases obviously playing into that, but thank you for that little bigger picture around that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's common. I see one of the fantastic comments about Wendy Lauer's book. There's a lot of interesting books in other genocides where it's been similar, where the women who participated are often just seen as different or other. There's a really interesting book called Mothers, Monsters, Whores, which looks at women in a lot of different extreme violence situations. And similarly, how often when you see women engaging in these acts, we're so socialized to think, how is this happening in this way? And how can women do this? And this is, certainly not unique to Rwanda. It's a global phenomenon where women who engage in violence are often just seen differently. But yeah, I appreciate your mentioning too, the children often, absolutely. There was a lot of propaganda during the genocide that Tutsi were dangerous, and whether it was over the radio station RTLM or spread by local leaders, there were ridiculous stories that Tutsi were cannibals, that they were cutting fetuses out of bodies. Like the stories that were being spread that were causing fear amongst individuals were just extreme. So absolutely your point that a lot of times individuals will talk about how they felt they had to protect their children or how they felt they had to protect someone. 100%.
Thank you for that. And then there's another question. Just before Carl spoke, I just wanted to say we did a podcast called Dangerous Women, and we spoke about some of these topics. And then there's a question from Tali, and she's asking, could you explain perhaps the reasons for these signs of acceptance? You spoke about signs of acceptance. Were neighbors interviewed, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. I have been interviewing community members for this project, both before the project started and afterwards. Not the specific community members of the people in the study, if that makes sense. I didn't want to invade their lives so much to talk with their specific community members, but every community in Rwanda is experiencing this. So more broadly, we've spoken as a team collectively with about 200 people about their experiences and what they think is happening and how they view this reentry and reintegration. I've also asked, have you visited someone who came back from prison? Why did you visit them? Things like that. And I think it's happening for a couple of different reasons. One, it is important to note that the government did a lot of work to prepare people to experience this widespread reentry and reintegration. And this is interesting. A lot of times governments don't really focus on the community members. In the US, we rarely have experiences where we prepare people to be ready to accept people coming back from prison, even though we have this happening all of the time. But in Rwanda, the government was pretty set on actually preparing individuals. So there were community meetings within communities at the state level, trying to prepare people for reentry and reintegration and trying to suggest that they should be willing to engage with individuals. One might suggest that people were just following the state. I don't think it's quite that simple, but I do think that this preparation was important as people had it on their mind to think, okay, people are coming back. We could be engaging with them in a certain way. I also think that in many cases, these individuals, when we asked them why they did what they did, oftentimes, they would say that they just wanted to move forward. There was this idea from many of the community members, the neighbors that we spoke with, that of course, they're going to continue to carry forward the memory of the genocide. And of course, this is something that's going to affect them for forever. But as a society, to really move forward and move beyond it in a way that could be healthy and productive, that there needs to be some additional facing of the past, and that this was important. Additionally, I will say many people reference gacaca, and it's something I'm still working through, to be honest, because I am a firm believer in restorative justice. And Carl and I were talking about this before this started, that very punitive policies, we actually see them backfire in a lot of criminological research and whatnot. So I don't know which aspect of gacaca was so important to folks, but a lot of folks did mention the fact that gacaca happened, that they came in front of people, that they stood trial, that they stood in front of their community. And they often compared it to the people who engaged in the violence but didn't go through gacaca. And they would say, well, these folks who were in prison, they're fine because they went through gacaca, they served their time. This is how they would frame it. But there are other folks who didn't do that, and they're the folks that I wouldn't go visit. But if they did this, if they went through this process, and if they had their day in gacaca and they were in front of the community, that's something that can help, and that I'm willing to go talk with them. So there was often this stark line drawn between the folks who went through gacaca and those who didn't, which does speak to something about gacaca that's important. And something
must have put up and down.
What?
Which flag must have put up and down?
Sorry, we will mute. We will mute.
I don't know. I'll do that. Can I just finish watching?
But let me say, we're going to mute.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I was going to say, I was trying to hear if it was a question. I was like, I can't hear.
No, it was.
It was just a background noise.
Oh, got it. Okay. Absolutely. So I was just saying at the end that it was essentially just, I think gacaca was important as well for facilitating this and for facilitating people's willingness. So I think it's a combination of a number of different factors that are intersecting, that are facilitating people's willingness to engage in these small gestures of reacceptance.
Thank you for that. And before I go to my next question, I just want to remind people, could you please make sure your sound is on mute so that we don't have any background noises interfering with our topic, our conversation. So there's a question from David Simon. It's quite a long, complicated question, but I'll try and break it down. So when you were speaking about the categories of perpetrators, so he said these are very interesting figures. Since gacaca trials also produced a lot of information about what happened beyond the question of the culpability of a specific trial subject. And B, many of the alleged more hardcore perpetrators fled to Zaire or the Congo, but did not return. And then so he's asking, is there a good estimate of the number of category 1 and 2 genocide perpetrators who were not tried via gacaca?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I don't know if we will ever know how many people weren't tried by Gacaca, which is a little bit tricky in that sense. But I will say a couple of things about that. The first is that there were trials in absence. So I do think that some of the people who fled were actually tried, but in absence. They didn't actually have their day in court. So in our study where we were trying to actually identify how many people went through this system, we found that about 57,000 individuals were pronounced guilty in absence. So I don't believe this is the full set of folks who fled or who didn't have their day in court, but I do think it is a good amount of them. And there was this emphasis on having these trials in absence and on sentencing folks, even if they could not be there. And this, I think, is capturing some of these individuals. But absolutely, I think that there are others who never stood trial, who did not have a trial in absence. And these individuals are really interesting for genocide studies. There's actually an article in the Journal of Peace Research from last year, I think. It's something about like men in the middle or something in the middle. And it's about precisely these individuals who fled, who haven't returned, and asking for the people who study Rwanda. Often we're interviewing the individuals who stayed or who fled and came back and who went through this process of the court system and whatnot, and asking if there would be important differences if you talk with the individuals who fled and didn't ever come back, and who often perhaps were more ideological. Often when we talk about the people who engaged in violence, there's an emphasis on, I'm not sort of de-emphasizing how much they believed in the genocide ideology, and looking at all these other factors that impacted why they participated, whether it was their fear that we were talking about, whether it was their social networks that really pulled them in, what were all these factors that impacted and pushed people towards violence. And this paper suggests that maybe the individuals who aren't back yet, which sounds very sound, are those who were a bit more ideologically following the anti-Tutsi rhetoric and really did believe that Tutsi were incredibly dangerous and that eradicating Tutsi was one of their major goals, and that we don't really see that a lot in some of our interviews because these individuals aren't back yet, which I know is a little bit of a segue from your question. So to sort of circle back, we don't know how many, but at least 57,000 people were found guilty in absence, although it's probably at least quite a bit more than that. And that leaving these individuals out of the story is interesting for this, but also because it's probably shaping how we view the people who participate in genocide, and that this subgroup of folks who were more radicalized, who likely did believe in the ideology a little bit more, are important to keep in mind. So I'm really glad that you raised that question, David.
I'll do maybe 2 or 3 more questions. There are a lot. We won't go through all the questions, but maybe 2 or 3 I'll ask you. We have a question from Marie Kruger. Now, one of the things you mentioned in your presentation is that the Gacaca courts, for example, took place in different parts of the country. So some were in the more urban areas, some were in the countryside. And so Marie is asking, in your study, in your research, how were the study participants selected and where are they located in Rwanda?
Oh, excellent question, Marie. Yes. So originally I had this master plan. For those of you who conduct research, you might appreciate that often you have this big plan and you kind of have this perfect idea of how you're going to go about doing the work. And then you get on the ground and you think, oh, this has to change a little bit. So my original goal was to randomly select the participants, completely random. And then I got to Rwanda, and for a variety of reasons, the number of people leaving prison in 2018 was much lower than other years, the years before and the years after. So we actually ended up asking every person who was leaving prison in 2018 if they wanted to participate in the study. And those who said yes were the ones who did participate. I have a list of those who would not participate, and I was actually pleased by that. It might mean that we do have a subset of individuals. There were about 25 who declined participation. I was pleased because, as we know from research, that individuals who are incarcerated often might feel sort of pressured to participate in research, often if they're in situations where they think they might benefit from it, or they might worry that, could not participating harm them. And we never want anyone to participate in research if they feel forced or if it's not something they want to do on their own agency. So I was really worried that we'd be showing up in these prisons, asking people to participate, and that they would participate because they thought it might help them in some way, or it might, show them in good graces with the prison authorities. So we did a lot of work to say, like, you don't have to participate. This is not anything that's going to impact you. The prison's not keeping record of who's participating and who's not. So I was really pleased that people said no, but it does mean that it's a non-random sample of folks who were going home. But essentially it's about 80% of all folks who were leaving in 2018 and going back to their communities. Interestingly, this did mean that we were able to get a wide range of folks who were leaving prison in Tiege, which again was important, men and women, and also folks leaving across the country. So actually, they're in both urban and rural communities, sort of countrywide. And this was a small nightmare for following them and conducting the follow-up interviews, because it meant that even though Rwanda is about the size of Maryland, sometimes you can drive somewhere and it can take 4.5, 5 hours on less than ideal roads. So it did mean that sometimes we would travel all over just to find one person and get an interview, and we drive 6 hours and talk with them for 3 hours and drive back. And my wonderful team were just troopers throughout all of that, because it was quite a process to find everyone throughout the community. But yeah, they were in communities all across Rwanda, and that does mean that we can look at differences in different parts of the country, because we know that the violence unfolded differently in different parts of the country, and differences in terms of urban and rural, but also differences, even though I don't have answers for this yet, but in the communities where there are a lot of survivors or not, or the communities where a lot of people participated or not. And how does this possibly impact these experiences that people are having? Because even though I've told this general story, I do think there is variation. And I think as we go forward, we'll be looking at the community level and paying more attention to some of the dynamics in the communities, and in the communities where a lot of people participated versus a few people participated. I'm guessing those are the ones where people are having easier times, or in the communities with a lot of survivors. I don't know how that's impacting yet, but trying to pay more attention to some of these variations and how that might impact people's experiences as they come home.
Just a quick follow-up question before I ask you the very last question. Was there a big difference in the responses between participants who lived in the urban or city areas versus participants who lived in the more rural areas? Was there a big difference in how they responded?
Yeah, so generally, it's a really good question. Generally, I'd say the folks who are living in the urban areas are less socially integrated. And it could have gone either way, right? So in the rural communities, everyone knows everyone. This is somewhat the case in an urban area, but if you're in Kigali, you might not know your neighbor a little bit, a couple streets over. Whereas if you're in a rural area, you could show up in a pretty wide area and say, like, I'm looking for this person, and they'll be like, oh yeah, they live over there. So I wasn't sure how this was going to matter, because I thought perhaps actually in rural areas where people were known well, could this actually harm them going back where everyone knows, okay, they're so-and-so, they're coming back from prison or Tiege, this is what they did during the genocide, they were at their Gacaca trial and they saw what happened. So I thought maybe that might harm them, but actually it's been generally the opposite. And the folks going back in the rural areas who are well known in their communities are generally the ones who are more socially integrated and just doing better overall than the folks in the urban areas who could benefit from the anonymity of someone who's coming back to a community where everyone doesn't know who they are and doesn't really even maybe know that they were in prison or Tiege for genocide. These folks are less integrated generally in the urban areas.
Wow, thank you for that. And then very, very last question. Did the people who went through, this is again from Carl, did the people who went through the Tiege experience have a greater chance of a more genuine welcome compared to those who did all their time in prison?
Yeah, I'm happy you read that one. I was just seeing Carl type that and I thought that's such a great question. Yes, I think so. I think Tiege facilitated better reentry and reintegration experiences in a number of different ways. And I'm now trying to tease out which aspects of it did. But absolutely, the folks who were in Tiege are generally doing better, generally more welcomed. Although I will say often they had the chance to go home. So maybe their welcomes might not have been quite as great because they were back in their community a number of times. But nonetheless, it still means that the people in the community are used to seeing them, that they've been coming back to the community, that they were used to Rwandan society, society, that they, were used to some of the changes that had occurred in Rwandan society. They also are typically the ones who had confessed during their trial. So there's a lot going on with the folks in Tige. And it's hard to parse out which aspect is really mattering, but absolutely spot on with this question. Yes, the folks who went through Tige and left Tige to go back home versus those going prison to go back home have generally overall more positive reentry and reintegration experiences and are doing better than those who didn't. And I think it's somewhat akin for those of you in the US or in Europe or in other places. I'm not sure if South Africa has them, like halfway houses. So these places that people can go that sort of help prepare them to go home, so that they're not just going from the stark prison to home. So they have some type of preparation. Tige is somewhat functioning, I think, like a halfway house in the sense that they're able to go home every year. They're able to be out and about. They're able to move on their own. And this is aiding their reentry and their experience back, in addition to these positive welcomes as well.
Wow. Thank you for that, Hollie. That was wonderful. And thank you for answering all of those questions so clearly. This can be a very complicated conversation about this genocide. And so you've made it so clear and so easy for us to understand. Thank you very much for that. So before I close, I'm just going to ask Carl and Tali, is there any last remarks you'd like to say?
Tali, I'll let you have the last remarks, but I just really appreciated this and look forward to further communication. Hollie, thank you too for the work you dedicated. A lot of times there's research that we don't know much about, and we never do learn much about it. But I'm so grateful that not only did you do the research, but you're doing things to help us learn from that research. Both super important, and I can't thank you enough for that. And oh my, as a grandpa, your little guy looks like perfect.
And just to add from my side, and I see some of your researchers, participants are here with us. I see Eric here with us and some others. Thank you so much for being here and supporting this important research. And Hollie, thank you. And I look forward to the end of your research and some of the conclusions. And I'm so curious also the comparison between the, those that just committed crime and their integration compared to that group. So there is so much richness that can still come. And this is just the first of many meetings, I'm sure, and hopefully also in person, where we can learn from you. Thank you so much for giving of your time to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It was so wonderful talking with you, and I really appreciated your questions.
Thank you. All right, everyone, thank you very much. And wherever you're joining us, good evening, good morning, good night. And please join us on the 23rd of May. So it will be a Sunday for another of our incredible webinars. And this webinar will be looking at the genocide in Cambodia. So it will be on the 23rd of May at 8 p.m. South African time. So please join us for that. It's titled, First They Killed My Father, A Daughter Remembers. So it proves to be another interesting conversation. Thank you very much. See you next time.